What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to DR Reports. And before we dive into this absolute bombshell of a story, I need your help. We're on a mission to hit 1,000 subscribers, and we can't do it without you. If you're enjoying the content, if you want to stay updated on all the biggest stories in the NFL, hit that subscribe button right now. Now let's get into what might be the most embarrassing moment in Cleveland Browns history. And trust me, that's saying something.
Mike's next whereabouts is almost as interesting to me as any of these head coaching jobs because I love the way he runs an offense, and to be liberated from the head coaching duties, the mad genius could go run wild.
Mike McDaniel just did the unthinkable. The former Miami Dolphins head coach, a man who was supposedly one of the top candidates for the Cleveland Browns head coaching vacancy, has officially pulled his name out of consideration. That's right. He looked at the Browns organization, looked at owner Jimmy Haslam, looked at general manager Andrew Berry, and said, "No, thank you, I'm good." This isn't just a polite decline, this is a full-blown rejection that sends shockwaves through the entire NFL landscape. When a coach who's been out of a job for mere weeks turns down an interview with your franchise, you know something is seriously wrong in Cleveland. Let me paint the picture for you. Mike McDaniel was one of the first people the Browns interviewed when they fired their previous head coach. They got in early, conducted what reports suggest was a Zoom interview, and apparently things went well enough that a second interview was scheduled. This wasn't just a courtesy interview. This was a legitimate pursuit of a coach who, despite his recent firing in Miami, is still considered one of the brightest offensive minds in football. The Browns were actively courting him, setting up an in-person interview for Wednesday, probably rolling out the red carpet, preparing their pitch about how Cleveland is a destination franchise with a bright future. And then, at the last possible moment, McDaniel said, "Actually, I'm withdrawing my name from consideration." Can you imagine the phone call? Can you imagine the faces in the Browns front office when they got that news? Tom Pelissero broke this story, and the details are absolutely devastating for Cleveland. According to Pelissero's report, former Dolphins head coach Mike McDaniel informed the Browns that he was withdrawing from their head coaching search ahead of a scheduled in-person interview on Wednesday. But here's where it gets really interesting. McDaniel is still very much a candidate for the Baltimore Ravens and Las Vegas Raiders head coaching vacancies. On the very day he was supposed to interview with the Browns, he was instead interviewing for the Los Angeles Chargers offensive coordinator position. And according to sources, he has multiple offensive coordinator offers on the table and could have a new home very soon. Let's break down what this really means. Mike McDaniel looked at his options and decided that being an offensive coordinator, a position he's held before and technically a step down from head coach, with the Chargers was more appealing than being the head coach of the Cleveland Browns. Read that again. He would rather take a coordinator job in Los Angeles than be the head coach in Cleveland. That's not just a rejection. That's a statement. That's McDaniel telling the entire football world that the Browns organization is so dysfunctional, so unappealing, that he'd rather reset his career trajectory than walk into that situation. Now, there are several theories floating around about why McDaniel made this decision, and we need to examine each one because they all paint a pretty damning picture of what's happening in Cleveland. Theory number one is that McDaniel simply got a better offer elsewhere. Maybe the Ravens or Raiders are ready to pull the trigger on hiring him as their head coach. Maybe one of these offensive coordinator positions came with a salary that rivals head coaching money and the promise of being the head coach in waiting. That's certainly possible. Mike McDaniel is a talented coach who turned Tua Tagovailoa into a legitimate NFL quarterback and created one of the most explosive offenses in football. He's going to have options. But theory number two is far more interesting and far more troubling for Browns fans. What if McDaniel pulled out because he realized he wasn't actually going to get the job? Think about it. You're Mike McDaniel. You've had your Zoom interview. You're scheduled for the in-person meeting. But maybe you start hearing through back channels that the Browns are really more interested in someone else. Maybe you hear that Jimmy Haslam and the front office want a young coach they can control, someone without the pedigree or the leverage to push back on organizational decisions. So rather than fly to Cleveland, go through the whole dog and pony show, and then get rejected, you pull out first. You control the narrative. You make it look like it was your choice. It's a savvy move, honestly, and it would explain the timing. Why withdraw the day before your interview unless you know something we don't? Theory number 3, and this is the one that should terrify Browns fans, is that Mike McDaniel simply wanted nothing to do with the Cleveland Browns organization. Maybe he did his homework. Maybe he talked to former coaches who've been through that building. Maybe he looked at how they've treated head coaches over the years, how they've cycled through talent, how they've consistently failed to build a stable, winning culture despite having resources and talent. Maybe he looked at the Deshaun Watson situation, the massive contract that handcuffs the franchise, the questions about whether ownership will actually let a coach make football decisions. Maybe he looked at all of that and said, "This isn't worth it. I'd rather take less money and less prestige to be in a situation where I can actually succeed." And honestly, can you blame him? Let's look at the Browns' track record with head coaches. Since 1999, when the franchise returned to Cleveland, they've had 10 different full-time head coaches. 10. That's not including interim coaches. That's averaging about 2.5 years per coach. Chris Palmer, Butch Davis, Romeo Crennel, Eric Mangini, Pat Shurmur, Rob Chudzinski, Mike Petting, Hugh Jackson, Freddie Kitchens, Kevin Stefanski. Some of these guys got 1 year, some got 2. Very few got the chance to actually build something sustainable. The only one who lasted was Kevin Stefanski, and even he just got fired after 5 seasons despite taking the team to the playoffs multiple times. What does that tell you? It tells you that being the head coach of the Cleveland Browns is a career suicide mission. You're walking into a situation where the organizational structure is unclear, where ownership has a history of meddling, where the front office's vision might not align with yours, and where fan expectations are simultaneously sky high and deeply cynical. You're expected to win immediately with a roster that has holes, with a quarterback situation that's a mess, and with an ownership group that has shown time and time again that they have no patience for a rebuild. Now let's talk about the elephant in the room, Jimmy Haslam. Reports have been swirling that Haslam and the Browns front office want a young coach. The word on the street is that they want someone they can control, someone who won't push back too hard, someone who will implement their vision rather than bringing their own. If you're Mike McDaniel, a coach who has his own offensive philosophy, who has proven he can run an NFL offense at the highest level, why would you want to walk into a situation where you're essentially going to be a puppet? Why would you subject yourself to that when you have other options? And here's where it gets even more interesting. There's another name that keeps popping up in connection with the Browns job, Sean McDermott. The former Buffalo Bills head coach, who was also recently fired, has history with Cleveland. Back in 2016, the Browns interviewed McDermott for their head coaching position. According to reports, Paul DePodesta, the Browns' chief strategy officer, was very high on McDermott at the time. But ultimately, Cleveland went with Hugh Jackson instead. Yeah, Hugh Jackson, who went on to compile one of the worst coaching records in NFL history with the Browns. Meanwhile, McDermott went to Buffalo, built the Bills into a perennial playoff contender, developed Josh Allen into an MVP caliber quarterback, and established himself as one of the best defensive minds in football. Now, some insiders are suggesting that Haslam might be holding on to that 2016 evaluation, thinking that maybe they should have hired McDermott the first time around. But here's the thing. If you were Sean McDermott, would you want to go to Cleveland now? You were good enough for them in 2016 when you were an unknown defensive coordinator. They passed on you. You went elsewhere, proved yourself, built an incredible resume, and now they come crawling back? That's got to leave a bad taste in your mouth. You're telling me that I wasn't good enough then, but now that I've proven myself elsewhere, suddenly I'm the guy? That's not exactly a ringing endorsement of the organization's evaluation skills. And let's be real about what Sean McDermott would be walking into. The Browns have Deshaun Watson on the roster with a fully guaranteed contract that runs through 2026. Watson was traded to Cleveland with massive fanfare, given a record-breaking contract, and has been nothing short of a disaster. He's injury-prone, he's underperformed when healthy, and he comes with baggage that has divided the fan base and brought negative national attention to the franchise. Any head coach taking the Browns job has to figure out what to do with Watson. Do you commit to him as your starter and try to rebuild your offense around him? Do you bench him and eat the contract? Do you try to trade him and hope someone else will take on that albatross of a deal? None of these are good options. Then there's the roster situation. The Browns have talent, no question. Myles Garrett is one of the best defensive players in football. They've got pieces on both sides of the ball, but they also have holes, particularly along the offensive line and at skill positions. They're in salary cap hell because of the Watson contract. They don't have a clear identity. Are they a defensive team that wins low-scoring games? Are they an offensive team that's going to score points? What's the vision? And more importantly, who gets to decide that vision? Is it the head coach, or is it Jimmy Haslam and the front office? These are the questions that any prospective head coach has to ask before taking the Cleveland job. And clearly, Mike McDaniel asked those questions and didn't like the answers he was getting. Now, the Browns are down to 5 candidates, according to reports, and they're going to need to expand their search. They've been looking for a coach longer than almost any other team because they were one of the first to make a move, firing their previous coach early in the process. And yet, here we are, with other teams having already hired their coaches, locked in their staffs, and started preparing for the draft and free agency, while Cleveland is still floundering. What does this say about the Browns as an organization? It says that coaches around the league see them as a toxic situation. It says that even guys who are out of work, even guys who are considering coordinator positions, would rather go elsewhere than deal with the Cleveland Browns. And that should be alarming for every Browns fan out there because it suggests that the problems run deeper than just finding the right coach. The problems are structural, they're organizational, they're cultural. Let's talk about the other teams in the coaching carousel and compare them to Cleveland. The Las Vegas Raiders need a coach. They've got their own dysfunction, sure, but they also have some young talent and a market that's attractive to coaches. The Baltimore Ravens, if they decide to move on from John Harbaugh, which seems unlikely but was being discussed, are a stable organization with a proven track record of developing players and winning games. The Chargers, who are looking for an offensive coordinator, have Justin Herbert, one of the best young quarterbacks in football, and play in Los Angeles, one of the biggest media markets in the world. Even teams that have already hired coaches like the New York Jets bringing in Aaron Glenn have a clearer vision and a more attractive situation than Cleveland. And that's the reality that Browns fans have to face. Their team isn't a destination. It's a last resort. It's where coaches go when they have no other options. And even then, they might say no. Mike McDaniel had options, and he chose literally anything else over being the head coach of the Cleveland Browns. That's not just embarrassing. It's a 5-alarm fire for the organization. Now, some people are going to try to spin this. They're going to say, well, maybe McDaniel just wanted to be a coordinator again. Maybe he wanted less pressure. Maybe he's got family in Los Angeles. And sure, maybe those things are factors, but you don't pull out of a head coaching interview the day before it's scheduled unless something significant has changed. You don't walk away from the opportunity to be a head coach in the NFL, a position that only 32 people in the world hold at any given time, unless the situation is so unappealing that it's not worth pursuing. There's also been some chatter, some really unfortunate chatter, about Shedeur Sanders and whether his presence or the speculation about the Browns potentially drafting him has anything to do with the coaching search struggles. Let me be crystal clear about this. Shedeur Sanders has absolutely nothing to do with Mike McDaniel pulling out of the Browns' head coaching search. Shedeur is a college quarterback who hasn't even been drafted yet. To suggest that coaches are avoiding Cleveland because of speculation about a potential draft pick is absurd and frankly insulting to everyone involved. The problems in Cleveland existed long before anyone started talking about Shedeur Sanders, and they'll exist whether the Browns draft him or not. This is about organizational dysfunction, not about a college kid who's trying to start his NFL career. What's really fascinating about all of this is the timing and the optics. Mike McDaniel was interviewing for the Chargers offensive coordinator job on the same day he was supposed to have his in-person interview with the Browns. That's not a coincidence. That's a choice. He chose to pursue a coordinator role over a head coaching role because the coordinator role was with a better organization. Think about what that says. The Chargers, who have had their own struggles over the years, who just fired their head coach, are still a more attractive landing spot for a coordinator position than the Browns are for a head coaching position. And let's talk about Jim Schwartz because he's emerged as one of the front runners for the Browns job now that McDaniel is out. Schwartz is a veteran coach, a defensive-minded guy who's been around the league forever. He was the head coach of the Detroit Lions years ago, had some success, had some struggles, and has since been a coordinator and assistant around the league. He's a solid choice, a safe choice. But is he the innovative offensive mind that the Browns need to fix their quarterback situation and maximize their offensive talent? Is he the guy who's going to come in and revolutionize the way Cleveland plays football? Probably not. He's a steady hand, a floor raiser, someone who will bring discipline and structure. But is that enough in today's NFL where offensive innovation is king? The other name being thrown around is Jesse Minter, a young defensive coordinator who's had success at the college level and is now getting looks in the NFL. Minter fits the profile of a young coach that Haslam reportedly wants, someone who could potentially be controlled, someone who doesn't have the leverage of a long NFL resume. But again, is that what the Browns need? Do they need someone who's going to defer to the front office? Or do they need a strong leader who's going to come in and demand control over football operations? Here's the bottom line. The Cleveland Browns are in crisis mode, and Mike McDaniel pulling out of their coaching search is just the latest symptom of a much larger disease. This organization has been dysfunctional for decades. They've cycled through coaches, general managers, quarterbacks, and schemes with alarming regularity. They've made blockbuster trades and big free agent signings that have blown up in their faces. They've drafted busts and passed on superstars. And through it all, the one constant has been ownership that seems more interested in making splashes than building something sustainable. Jimmy Haslam bought the Browns in 2012, and in the 12-plus years since, the team has made the playoffs exactly 3 times. 3 times in 12 years. That's not good enough. That's not acceptable for a franchise in a city as passionate about football as Cleveland. Browns fans deserve better. They deserve an organization that has a clear vision, that hires good people and empowers them to do their jobs, that builds through the draft and develops talent, and that doesn't panic and blow everything up every 2 years when things don't go perfectly. Mike McDaniel withdrawing from the coaching search is a reflection of all of that. It's a reflection of a coach looking at the Browns and deciding that the risk isn't worth the reward. It's a reflection of the NFL coaching community viewing Cleveland as a place where careers go to die rather than flourish. And until the Browns address the root causes of that perception, until they fix the organizational structure and the culture and the decision-making processes, they're going to keep having these problems. They're going to keep getting rejected by top candidates. They're going to keep hiring coaches who either weren't their first choice or who are desperate enough to take any job. The irony is that the Browns actually have pieces in place to be competitive. They have defensive talent. They have some young players on offense who could develop. They play in a division that, while tough, is not insurmountable. But none of that matters if you can't get the right leader in place, and you can't get the right leader in place if nobody wants the job. That's the vicious cycle that Cleveland finds itself in, and Mike McDaniel pulling out is just the latest turn of the wheel. So where do the Browns go from here? They're down to 5 candidates reportedly, and they're going to need to expand that pool. They're going to need to get creative. Maybe they look at college coaches who are ready to make the jump to the NFL. Maybe they look at coordinators who are hungry for their first head coaching opportunity and willing to overlook the organizational red flags for a chance to be a head coach. Maybe they pivot to a veteran like Sean McDermott, who has the pedigree and the experience to navigate a difficult situation. But whoever they hire, they need to give that person real power and real support. They need to let that coach build a staff, implement a system, and have time to see it through. No more 2-year experiments. No more undermining coaches with front office leaks. No more meddling from ownership. Because here's the thing, the Browns can hire the best coach in the world. But if the organizational dysfunction continues, it won't matter. The coach will fail, the team will struggle, and in 2 or 3 years, they'll be right back where they are now, searching for another coach and wondering why nobody wants the job. The definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results, and the Cleveland Browns have been insane for a very long time. Mike McDaniel withdrawing from the coaching search should be a wake-up call. It should force Jimmy Haslam and Andrew Berry and everyone else in that front office to look in the mirror and ask some hard questions. Why don't coaches want to work here? What are we doing wrong? How do we fix this? Because if they don't figure it out soon, the Browns are going to be stuck in mediocrity for another decade, and their long-suffering fans are going to continue to suffer. Share this video with your friends, especially if they're Browns fans who need to know what's really going on with their team. Let's get this story out there and hold these organizations accountable. Until next time, Keep it locked to DR Reports for all the biggest stories in football. Peace.